Welcome to today's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast, your channel for super easy, no-nonsense advice on how to declutter and organise your home. Please welcome your hosts, professional organisers Ingrid Jansen and Leslie Spellman.
Hello and welcome listeners to episode 36 of the Declutter Hub podcast. I'm Ingrid.
And I'm Leslie.
If you have clutter and want to sort it out, this is the show for you. In today's episode, Leslie and I are talking about decluttering and organizing stationery. Now, oh my gosh, I just love organizing stationery. I don't know how about you, Leslie, but there's something so interesting about opening drawers in a desk and kind of going, right, what do I find in here? And then to see that everything is muddled. And I just love sorting it all out. I don't know, maybe I'm a bit weird. I'm not sure. I think it's absolutely great.
I think it is very satisfying. And I think it's where we, as professional organisers, it's where we kind of come into our own a little bit, because there's quite a lot that we can offer people in by way of advice. And a lot of that is actually in the decluttering side of things as well, to be honest. It's not just about the organising. So I think, we really do make an impact in stationery. And I think it's really important to have your home office or wherever you've got your designated sort of paperwork space, organise your stationery so that your stationery doesn't become part of your junk drawer. Do you know what I mean? So it's got a knock-on effect, hasn't it? So I love doing stationery as well, so I can completely understand why you get excited by it, because we can make a big impact, I think.
Yeah. And I think, can we just first of all, just in broad terms, stationery or office supplies?
I think it's a bit of a grey area. Maybe it's one of those words that's just blended over the years into something different. But for me, stationery is a kind of catch-all for anything that you need in your sort of home office. And I think office supplies is where it veers more into a business environment, maybe.
Okay.
So I think office supplies would be something that you would go through the catalogue at work and get very excited about organising new things in packs of 24 and probably use them. But so stationery for me is a catch-all for anything. So it can be, paper, all of your hole punches, staplers, blah, 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 envelopes, packing materials, let's say, blue tack, all that kind of thing. For me would fall under the stationery category. And the sort of split off is one's business related and one's home related.
Okay. So let's just agree then to use stationery as the catch-all for everything we're going to talk to our listeners.
If you want to say home office supplies, you're very welcome to say that, Ingrid.
Because kind of in my head, maybe my rationale is, for me, I see stationery more as things that are from paper. So envelopes and notebooks and paper for the printer and that kind of thing. And office supplies is more all of the other bits like the staplers and the scissors. But it doesn't matter for me. We can just call it stationery as long as we can talk about zoning. Because I think we need to really make divisions within that stationery to make it work for our clients and for ourselves and for our listeners.
Exactly. So maybe we should ask our listeners to vote. Maybe we can have a face-off, Ingrid. Who is right, Ingrid or Leslie? And see what people say. Post in the comments. Who is right? No, it's not like that. So it's not a competition. But no, yeah, I feel as if I'm right because I'm a native speaker and you're not, but I'm probably completely wrong, aren't I? So anyway, right. Okay. So stationery / office supplies. I think we just jump straight in there and talk about all of the individual things that we find. And we're not going to be able to cover everything, but there are some for me, as I say, I talked about before, we can make a real impact as professionals, because what people do is a stationery drawer is a classic thing where people hang on to things for years and years and years because they think that they're going to come in handy at some point. And so there are things that for me are no longer really in use that often for most people, that people are still clinging on to, and they're cluttering up drawers and making these drawers not be usable because there's so much stuff in there. And there's loads and loads of things in the sort of stationery category. So let's start with the first one, a very interesting one from a psychological perspective, is notebooks. People have a notebook fetish, don't they, regularly?
Wow. The amount of notebooks I find. I mean, from everything, from like tiny ones to journalist kind of notebooks with rings on the top to the A4 sizes with a hardcover with rings with that. It is absolutely incredible. And then when you actually ask, when was the last time you used a notebook? They're like, oh yeah, I actually really use notes on my phone these days. And it's like, okay, there's tons of them around. Or they only like to use a specific size, but they've kind of gathered all of them along the way. So I'm like, well, can we not just declutter some of this very small sizes if you only want to use an A5 or an A4 size notebook?
Because notebooks sometimes are the things that you get given at conferences as giveaways and things like that. So they're not always, I think we have very specific needs and preferences when we're using notebooks in terms, so I like an A4 notebook to sort of jot, because I do a lot of scribbling and, sort of doodling, not very good doodling, I hasten to add, but when I'm always writing things down when we're chatting and things. And so it just depends, but I think what I really wanted to talk about is those people that covet a notebook. There are people who love nothing more than going to somewhere like Paperchase and buying a beautiful notebook. And sometimes, they can have, we've seen people with 50, 60, 70 notebooks sitting there, not being used, sadly, with these beautiful notebooks, but they're very difficult to get rid of, aren't they?
Yeah.
And so I don't really know what the answer is to those, because they are very beautiful, but you have to be a little bit hard on yourself sometimes if they're becoming overwhelming.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. In terms of the psychology, notebooks is definitely the one that people cling on to a lot in terms of stationery. But for me, in terms of storing them, they would go with general paper. So it depends on it depends on the setup of your stationery drawer. If you're lucky enough to have 4 or 5 drawers under your desk, that's the perfect scenario, isn't it? And Ingrid's going to talk much later about zoning, but in terms of where it would sit and where it would sit with, for me, it would be with other paper.
Yeah, I agree. Unless there are so many that it actually needs a separate drawer, but otherwise, for me, it would go with other paperwork like envelopes. So let's then talk about envelopes, Leslie, neatly going into the next category.
I think envelopes, again, life has moved on quite dramatically. So it depends on a lot of this is going to depend on what generation that we live in. I mean, my kids would never dream of going and buying envelopes from anywhere. They would just be like, is there an envelope in the house? They wouldn't know where they were. Do you know what I mean? Because we rarely send things anymore by post. We email things. So we very, very rarely send envelopes. And if we do send things in envelopes, often those envelopes come with a kind of SAE on them, self-addressed envelope or stamped addressed envelope or something like that. So quite often the envelopes come with the mail if you've got to return something by post. And so I think our need for the big volumes of envelopes that we needed in the past has decreased dramatically. So, but we still got hold of we're still clinging on to those envelopes. And so, we see things in stationery drawers from the kind of 70s and 80s, don't we, Ingrid, where the gum's not working on the envelopes anymore, but there's tons and tons of things. And it's quite hard to throw something away or recycle something. Obviously, envelopes can be recycled in certain parts of the country, and in other parts of the country, they won't recycle the ones that have got gum on them. So you just need to check in your local area. But we can recycle envelopes if we need to, and take it down to a manageable amount of envelopes. But we see too many. But for me, just keep the basic ones. I have an A4 size, an A5, and a manila. Even window envelopes. Do you need window envelopes? Is that the way that if you were sending a letter by post, would you use that kind of scenario on a window envelope? It's something that and people do like to gather stationery from their offices as well, don't they? Sometimes they like to do a little raid of the office cupboard. We're not advocating that at all, but sometimes things find the way home from offices. And we see quite a bit of that as well. And window envelopes fall into that category. So really think, why are you keeping 200 window envelopes if you never ever do that kind of that word kind of window scenario? But if you do, fine. Everyone's different.
I also would like to add something else to that, Leslie, because I also hold my birthday cards and my christening cards and wedding cards with my envelopes in my paper drawer. So what happens sometimes is that cards lose their envelope, and the envelope loses their cards, and then you end up with loads and loads of random envelopes. Yeah, I'm going to use them one day, and I'm like, well, I would rather that you keep the pack where they're all still together and they're all the same size than all these stacks of random envelopes that have lost their friend over the years. And I think it's really important to do a clear out of those as well, with the different colors and the different sizes. let it go, recycle it, and tidy up that drawer, and so you actually know what you have.
It's a classic sort of clutter procrastination thing, isn't it? You know, and as soon as we say, well, you can actually let go of those envelopes, you don't need them, you're not going to use them, why don't we declutter them? Oh, okay then. But
Yeah.
it's something that psychologically you struggle with, isn't it, yourself, to get rid of these envelopes. It's quite silly when you think about it. Of all the things that we keep, we're worried about, 20-year-old envelopes that are the wrong size that we never ever use. But it's just, well, they're going to come in one day, aren't they? But they might come in when we're 75, you know what I mean? And so do we need to keep them for that long is the question. So yeah, anyway, envelopes. So that's another one that people really struggle with. The other one that I wanted to talk about, which is kind of a passage of time, is how many houses do you go to? So I'm kind of laughing, honestly. I've got a big smile on my face laughing about the amount of Polly Pockets, those like, they are called Polly Pockets, aren't they? Those kind of folders with the holes down the side of them that are plastic, that you slot pieces of paper in. I mean, I absolutely loathe them with a passion, and I'll try and get rid of them out of every house that I ever work in if possible, because I think they're just awkward, unmanageable. It creates a barrier to putting your paperwork away. So you'll never, as soon as any clients that have ever worked with me, they know that if there's any Polly Pockets in the house, there's a good chance that by the end of the session, they're going to be long gone. But then if we do that, then people keep hold of the old Polly Pockets. And so I often find box files, magazine files with like 300, 400 Polly Pockets. And they're useful when you're a student maybe, or when you're at work, and if you've got to do that sort of scenario. But then they become less, what Ingrid's laughing now at the Polly Pocket fetish. It's like a crazy.
Listen, I don't mind a Polly Pocket at all, and I actually use them. But listeners, I agree with Leslie. When you've done a massive paperwork declutter, or there's different levels of Polly Pockets as well. Some of them are absolutely rubbish. They're too thin, they're too flimsy, and I think those are not good. Buy a little bit better quality if you like using a Polly Pocket. I'm a lever arch girl file. Hell, what can I say? I love a Polly Pocket in my lever arch file system, but I try to have a bit better quality. And also over the years, if they come a bit grimy and a bit grotty and a bit yucky, I throw them away. And I think that's what I see in my clients' houses, is stacks and stacks of them. Some of them that are still in kind of good quality, please by all means keep them. But if they're a bit crumbled up and falling apart and just not good, then take them out and if you can recycle them. But I think I'm sorry to say that we're at the throwing away phase for Polly Pockets at the moment. But if you still have 500 that are in good condition, you don't need that many, stick with 50 and that's fine. And then let go of the rest. I
think it's about being realistic about what your current lifestyle dictates you do. Yeah. And if you're somebody that just literally, I file very, very little. Everything's online, isn't it? And so, I don't think I've got any Polly Pockets. Is that really bad that I've got no Polly Pockets? I hate them. Is that clear?
That's very strong, isn't it?
How can I hate a plastic wallet? This is quite strange, isn't it? But no, I think it's because I've seen them taking over people's houses so much. I'm like, enough with the Polly Pockets. Let them go. There's no one saying and dictating we need to keep them.
But I think it's also because you've got a filing cabinet, so you like using the L folders. So for you, that is something that works really well. But if you a lever arch file, then a Polly Pocket can't be a bad thing. So I think it really depends on what kind of system you have at home. But I think we're talking mainly about volumes here. Let's now then talk about ring binders and lever arch files and A4 folders and all of those kind of things. Tons. We find tons. I mean, there is nothing more annoying than a lever arch file where the lever actually is broken, or the little clips don't fit properly together anymore, or it doesn't shut properly. And I'm like, let's just please get that out of the house and use something that is properly working. Because if you want to be efficient and be productive, you need to have stuff that works really well. And if the clips don't close properly in a ring binder, nothing more annoying than that.
Yeah, it's broken. Yeah. And it's not effective anymore. Yeah. But again, it's that psychology of things. Things like lever arch files are expensive, to buy, aren't they? To buy a good one, and one thing that I would always recommend if you are going down the lever arch file route with your filing, and Ingrid and I will never agree on this ever, that buy a good one, don't buy a cheap one, because it's going to break and it's going to become not fit for purpose really quickly. But it's something that, because we spend a lot of money on and because we think it's going to come in again, that we keep hold of. Now, to keep, imagine if you keep 5 or 6 lever arch files, that's a lot of space that you're giving over to old files that you may or may not use in the future. Now, if you've got, teenagers coming through that need lever arch files for work or for school, then and that you're going to have an ongoing need for those, that's great. So we're not saying at all don't ever use it, you never ever need to recycle a lever arch file, because that's not true. But you've got to look at your current scenario and be realistic about whether you do that, and don't just cling on to them for no reason because you think that they're going to come in, or you think that they cost a lot of money, or you're worried about needing them again. Because ultimately most people could go out and buy a new lever arch file if they needed one.
Yeah. Actually, before I forget, I think you touched upon something really important there, Leslie. You said about buy good quality. And I think that especially goes for a stapler and a hole punch, to buy something that is good quality, because there's nothing more annoying than trying to staple something with a stapler that is falling apart, or trying to punch a hole that is crooked and wonky. So those are definitely, and a pair of scissors. Those are, I think, my 3 favorite organizing and stationery products are a stapler, a hole puncher, and a pair of scissors. Those, I think, are the 3 things you actually buy a little bit of better quality for, that you can afford, instead of buying something cheap, because that will pay off definitely.
Do you know what is interesting is that we find all the time is we find these little mini staplers, almost like sort of miniature size.
I know.
And those are the kind of things, if you're really tight on space and you're in a studio flat, perfect, of course. Or if you're a child and you're taking that in your pencil case or something like that. But in general, a normal size stapler is what you need. And you probably only need one of them.
Yeah.
Or, maybe your kids have got one in their bedroom as well. But, in your office, you don't need multiple staplers. And that's another thing that tends to breed, isn't it? Staplers and staples. And so, but I'm definitely a staple girl rather than a paperclip girl for keeping paperwork together. What do you prefer, Ingrid?
Yeah, definitely. I'm not a paperclip person at all. I hardly use them. I love stapling stuff together, because immediately 3 or 4 or 5 loose papers become one, which is immediately makes it less chaotic. And that's why, like you, I have a stapler on my desk, ready to go, ready for action.
And then there's also, nowadays, there's these no staple staplers. What do you think about those? I mean, environmentally, they're going to be good. Have you come across those?
No, not yet, but I've heard about them, but I haven't seen them in action just yet. But I think I've seen them. I think it's very fascinating. And I think, of course, anything for the environment is good by me. So if it works, why not?
You talked about hole punches.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that I want to talk about with hole punches is, they can be quite big. To get a good quality hole punch, to punch quite a few pieces of paper at the same time.
Yeah.
But make sure if you're tight on storage in your drawer, because they're those kind of things that jam your drawer when you're opening them, don't they? Because they stick up. Yeah. And so there is, a lot of people don't know, but there are things on the side of many hole punches to keep them shut. So there's like a little catch that you can move across to keep them shut. And the kind of measuring thing that sticks out, I don't even, that plastic thing that sticks out the side of a hole punch, for whether it's an A3 or an A4 or whatever, that can get shoved back in. So, if you are putting things away and you don't want things to be cluttering up and jamming in your drawers as you're opening them, do find that little catch, because, the amount of people that I say, oh, I didn't know that was there. So, so do that with a hole punch. But there's not much really we can say about a hole punch other than you don't need loads and loads of hole punches. Again, you probably only need one in your office, and maybe if you've got kids doing different things, that's a separate issue. Have one good hole punch and let it have a home so that it can be found when it is needed to be found.
Yeah. So how do you feel about calculators then, Leslie? Because you can now use your phone. There's a calculator on your phone. Do you still have a calculator in your stationery drawer?
I do. I have a desk calculator that I've had for donkey's years that I leave sitting there. I just prefer it. I think because I'm getting old, I can't see things. I need like the big numbers on there. So I have a desk calculator. But again, with clients, what we see is these kind of, what do you call those, scientific calculators from our kids with all the like really complicated stuff on there that we're never ever going to use really in normal day-to-day life. Keep it simple, desk calculator with numbers, or just use your phone. You know, if you're tight on space, that's a case in point. And some people are much more used to doing that. I've not quite, obviously I use my phone when I'm out and about, but when I'm at home, I tend to use my calculator and it's on my desk the whole time.
And also have a test. If you've got several calculators, have a test which ones are actually still working. You know, because sometimes we keep things, but then it seems later the batteries run out, or the little solar panel thing doesn't work properly, or it's just dodgy and it's a bit wobbly to when you're trying to type stuff in on the keyboard. You know, try things out before just putting it back and thinking, oh yeah, well, I want to keep them all.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's another thing because calculators, again, can be expensive, can't they? Those scientific calculators are like £20 or more, aren't they, really? Mm-hmm. So you feel guilty, don't you, getting rid of them? But if you did get rid of them, you know, you can send them to a charity shop if they are still working. You know, don't think that you can't send stationery. I regularly send a whole bag of stationery to the charity shop, loose envelopes, papers, notebooks, boxes of staples, you know, quite happy, and they're delighted. Even if they're not going to sell them, they'll use them in the charity shop as well. So, you know, don't just throw these things away into landfill. But if it was a calculator, I think that it can go into the small appliance recycling section of the tip because it's got little bits of metal kind of things. I'm not very good at electronics, but it's an electronic thing, isn't it? So that's where I would put it if I was going to recycle it at the tip.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So how about rulers then? I find them in all different kinds of sizes, kid sizes, you know, the long ones, loads of them.
Snapped in half.
One should be enough, right? One large one and one small one should be enough, I think.
Definitely for normal, you know, obviously if you're artistic or if you're doing things or drawing or if you're draftsman or I don't even know whether draftsmen use rulers or not, but there's going to be some jobs, aren't there, where people are using rulers much more readily. But in general, the only time I ever use a ruler is when we're doing name badges for our courses that we run, you know, but things like that. But rulers are the kinds of things that people get as mementos as well. So we often have quite a lot of rulers from Spain or from the Tower of London or things like that, and our kids have got them. So, you know, just make sure you've got one good ruler of a decent size, maybe the bigger size, and don't have multiple rulers. You know, this will go down over time with your kids. Kids will certainly have loads and loads of rulers, but even when I'm doing my kids are older now, you know, they've probably only got one or two now, and that goes once they leave school, really. So yeah, these are just the kind of things, and I'm sure a lot of you out there think, oh yeah, I've got loads and loads of rulers. It's just something that we never quite get around to because it's not critical. You know, the stationery drawer is never going to be completely overwhelming our whole house, but the feeling that you've got when you actually get your stationery under control and zoned, which we're going to talk about in a minute, is really, you're like, oh, look at me with my fancy, lovely stationery drawer. You get all excited, don't you? Well, we do. It's like just us. I'm sure our listeners must get excited too. So yeah, rulers is a good one that you can declutter. Again, so, you know, if they're in good condition, send them off to the charity shop because somebody will use them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And then I also you briefly touched upon paper clips there and staples. And I want to talk about kind of pins and kind of all the small the bulldog clips and all those kind of little bits and bobs that what I see is that they sometimes have these nice round containers with a little bit of everything, but then they also have lots of other stuff. And it's like, it's just, you know, if I would say keep the container with a little bit of everything and maybe a box separately of the staples that fit your stapler, but everything else is just this massive surplus, isn't it?
I think what it does, you know, the reason why we like those little round containers because they containerize and divide everything, and that's what we love to do as organisers. So they've done the job for us. Yeah. But actually, in a volume that's suitable and reasonable, you know, so not ridiculous amounts of bulldog clips. You know, those are things. Some people love the bulldog clips. You know, people tend to have things that they use all the time. So, you know, but I would never use a bulldog clip for anything ever. So, you know, to me, I'm using my stapler. I don't even use a paper clip, you know, so it depends on what you do, but I wouldn't not want to have any paper clips in the house. And so these nice little containers that have got a paper clip, thumbtacks, a small bulldog clips, and maybe some elastic bands, which we'll talk about in a minute. That's the kind of volumes that's sensible for me. And I take those with me when I'm doing paperwork jobs with clients as well, just in case they can't find what they've got in their own house. So it doesn't slow us down. Elastic bands, people have a lot of those, don't they? When was the last time you used an elastic band?
I use one 2 times a year, and I can tell you exactly when I do the kids' birthday cards, and I keep them together and I put an elastic band around them because they're still little, so I like them to show and go through it later with the cards that they got, and do a bit of more sorting later. But if I have a couple of cards that I want to keep, then I put an elastic band around them. But boy, oh boy, have I found elastic bands that are completely just been obliterated through time and are falling apart and crumbling, and they get really yucky, don't they?
Yeah, exactly. Elastic bands are quite manky, and so are biodegradable. You know, when you find a Tesco carrier bag from 15 years ago that's perished, and it's like the worst thing as an organizer because it goes everywhere.
Yeah.
And elastic bands fall into that category as well because they snap and they're all quite strange. So, you know, be reasonable about the amount of elastic bands that you're going to need as well, because that's something that years ago we used much more of. You know, when people were gathering paperwork together, they would use much more of them. We don't really use them that much now. I'm sure people do, you know, and what we're talking about here is we're talking about domestic circumstances. We're not talking about in an office environment, in a business environment, because I'm sure there are scenarios where people will use elastic bands the whole time. But just be reasonable and really think, when was the last time I used an elastic band? And actually, if I only had 20, would I cope with that? And would that be a suitable amount for you?
Yeah. I don't think I even have 20 in my house. I must have a little box with just a couple in them. It's fine. You know, it's enough. And then when that runs out, when there's one left, I can always then buy a new little box with some other ones.
I don't think I've got any elastic bands.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Radical.
So how about Pritt sticks, Leslie?
I've got one Pritt stick that's not dried up.
They do dry up. It's incredible.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's it. Check your Pritt sticks and make sure they're not dried up, because they dry up really quickly, don't they?
Yeah.
And particularly if you've got kids and stuff. So yeah, Pritt sticks is something that we throw away quite readily as well, isn't it?
And also, same talking about drying up, highlighters. And I actually do love using a highlighter. But a highlighter as well, you need to test them on a regular basis because they dry up as well. And there's nothing more annoying than taking a highlighter with you somewhere and then finding out it actually doesn't work.
Even in the middle of a decluttering session with clients, we'll test pens, you know, get a piece of paper out, get those notebooks into use and start using the pens and testing them. And the good thing nowadays is, you know, there's so many schemes out there. There's a scheme called TerraCycle at the moment where they're looking at loads of different sort of random bits of plastic mainly that you can recycle, and people have got drop-off points for things like contact lens pods and felt tips, and I'm sure Polly Pockets might even be in there, Ingrid. That would be nice, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I think for the kids' pens, the felt tip pens from Crayola, I think Crayola do a really good scheme that you can actually send the empty Crayola pens back to Crayola themselves.
Yeah,
So,
I think the felt tip ones, actually, you're absolutely right. I think, because again, felt tips are something that with the passage of time, the kids kind of move through felt tips and then they stop using them. But we kind of think, oh, we need to keep a felt tip, don't we? You know, and colouring pencils and things. Be really honest about where your kids are in their stage of life and whether or not we actually need felt tips and coloured pencils. And if not, you know, offload them. You know, felt tips, can we send them to charity? You've got to be really careful with that because they're probably going to be past their best. You know, if you do want to send them to somebody, you know, really check that they're still good and they've still got some life in them. But that Crayola recycling scheme is a good one to check out, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think if you are gonna tackle your pen drawer, I would say divide them into fountain pens, felt tip pens, and then pencils, and then check each category first before deciding what's keeping and what's going, because you definitely don't want to pass on any other things that are dead to other people. You know, if it doesn't work, what's the point?
Yeah. So talking about fountain pens, it's something. There are very few people nowadays who write. I've got a client actually who writes with a fountain pen every day. but I think she's like the only person that I know in life who does that. But fountain pens are things that we tend to keep hold of, and the ink along with it. So, but they're quite hard because a lot of times fountain pens have been given as gifts, haven't they? Or there's something that we got when we were 11, when we started secondary school or something like that. But yeah, think carefully. If it's not a really special fountain pen, it can go as well, and the ink along with it, because it's quite dangerous ink in those bottles, isn't it? When you've got kids in the house particularly. So yeah, the ink should go. But yeah, it depends, because there are people who absolutely love a fountain pen because they do write beautifully, don't they?
Yeah. And if I think about pencils, I also think about pencil sharpeners. I mean, how many rubbish pencil sharpeners can be out there in the world? I mean, you get them in these children's packs and they never, ever sharp properly. So keep the proper one and maybe even test them out and see if they're actually sharp properly. So
you're better off investing in one good one, really, aren't you? Rather than having all the little ones. I mean, obviously, the kids need them in their pencil cases. They're not going to take a desk pencil sharpener to school, are they? But so that's when the little ones come in, and that's when they tend to breed, and we tend to have a lot of them. And the same with rubbers as well. We have a lot of rubbers as well. And you don't, once your kids have gone, certainly once they're in secondary school, they're barely using pencils, and so they're not going to use rubbers really.
Just listeners, in case you are an American listener and think about what on earth is she talking about? She's talking about an eraser here. An eraser. A rubber is completely different, Leslie, in other parts of this world.
Okay, sorry everybody, sorry. I do mean something to rub out pencil markings, just and nothing else. So yeah, that's fine. Right, okay, moving swiftly on to talking about ink and things like that. Printer cartridges. Make sure if you've got loads of printer cartridges knocking around that they fit your current printer, because a lot of people keep hold of them. Take the time to check, to cross-reference the code on the printer cartridge and the code on your printer to make sure that they're still, because unfortunately we go through printers at quite a rate of knots these days, because printers are cheapish, aren't they? And the cartridges are things that cost a lot of money, so people tend to change printers quite regularly. But there's loads and loads of printer cartridge recycling schemes out there, to send them back to where you got them from or whatever. So it's not difficult to recycle printer cartridges these days. But we tend to keep hold of printer cartridges because we're not quite sure, because we've not done that final thing, which is, let me just double check whether that is for my current printer or not.
Yeah. And also the same goes for lots of other computery bits and disks and software keys and little cables and all of those things. Are they actually for equipment that's still in your house? I find lots of things in a home office stationery section that have to do with, oh gosh, that was from the previous printer. So not only the cartridges, but also the cables and the software keys and the manuals and the disks that you had to, in the previous life, had to put in your computer to install it. All of that kind of stuff. Have a look through it and see, is it still in use? And is it still something that belongs to stuff that I have now in my house?
Yeah, because things move on so fast, don't they? And wires move on, and the ends. I was working with a client last week, and I was so delighted because he knew what every single wire was and whether or not he needed it anymore. And I was like, oh, this, because normally we just have to keep it all, don't we? Because we're not quite sure, and we're not sure, or you need to check with somebody else. And so I think it was like the best. I'm like, oh, this is just such a nice job where someone understands what all these wires are. So yeah, but there are a lot of things that can go these days. You don't need the software keys for a lot of things these days. People have still got PC games hanging around. People just don't use those kind of things anymore, do they? But they tend to sit, don't they, with the other computer bits and bobs, and that now definitely goes into your stationery storage, doesn't it?
Yeah. And also what I wanted to also share with our listeners is all those discs, the CD rewritable discs and the DVD rewritable discs. I can't even say it anymore. But I find them in the bottom of drawers. And it's like, oh yeah, it holds some photos. Well, maybe now's the time to see if you can actually still plug it into your computer, and you can just put it on your hard drive and on your cloud. So you don't have all these random CDs with possibly photos or old games or whatever it all is. can declutter all of that. So that's really nice to do a clear out as well.
Yeah, so when you're doing your stationery stuff and you find these kind of DVDs and CDs with things on them and you need to double check them, sometimes they're files from work or photographs and we're never quite sure what they are. Write a to-do list with any decluttering job. Write an action list of things that need to be done and try and do them, because now this is your time. You're decluttering. You're going through one room at a time or one area at a time. Now is your time to actually do some of those things that you've been putting off and procrastinating about for so long. So have we rattled through all of the stationery? I'm sure there are loads more categories of things. I know that there are in stationery, but I think that the sort of messages of today is things have moved on in terms of the way that we work now because of the computer age. And so we need much, much less stationery now than we used to in years gone by. And so give yourself the opportunity to look at that, to declutter it, to get rid of some stuff and to give yourself a little bit more space to breathe. And then that will then give you the space to organize it, which is what we are going to talk about now.
Yes, I think it's very important to start. If you've got lots and lots of stationery, or even if you've got little amounts of stationery, you still have to divide it. And if you have a desk like we talked about before, and you are lucky enough to have a couple of drawers, you can use one drawer for all of those kind of desky kind of things. So staplers, scissors, all of those bits. You can use one drawer for paper and envelope, one drawer maybe for your printer paper, one drawer for some files and the couple of poly pockets that are allowed in your house, and some A4 ring binders. So divide it all out and put it into different zones. If you do not have any drawers in your desk, see if you can create maybe some boxes and that way sort it out. The cookies box from IKEA might be really, really helpful. It has a lid, you can staple them. We'll put a link in the show notes to those cookies boxes. We really like them. For the smaller, like little bits of stationery, see if you can use just some Tupperware pots or maybe some plastic boxes from your takeaway containers and divide it like that. And that's where you put in your paper clips and your staplers and your pins and all the kind of little bits and bobs that otherwise start flying through that drawer and go everywhere. So that, I think, is really important for zoning and dividing it and using little plastic containers to divide it all out a bit.
Yeah, definitely. It doesn't need to be anything expensive, does it? Like you say,
No.
takeaway containers are perfect for most. Maybe the standard sort of Chinesey kind of ones are not perfect for pens. They're a little bit on the short side. So sometimes you do have to do something different for your pens. But they're perfect for all the other stuff.
Yeah.
Just realised while we were talking, we've missed out like the most important stationery item ever, the label machine and labels. I think we have forgotten our most important organising tool. And that for me would sit in with stationery as well. So if there's one thing that we're going to allow you to buy, listeners, as declutterers, buy yourself a lovely little label machine, because we absolutely love them, don't we? So yeah, I was like, oh my God, I didn't even mention the label machine. So yeah.
I thought you were going to say Post-it notes.
Oh yeah, we didn't mention Post-it. No, they fall in the same category. They're kind of labeling type things, aren't they?
Yeah.
So yeah, you're allowed those as well, and you're allowed a little label machine, which we absolutely love in terms of organising and particular categorisation. Then within that stationery drawer, labels would go a long way to keeping things nicely organised.
Yeah. Well, I've got nothing else to add, Leslie. I think we've actually talked about nearly just about any possible stationery product, but I'm sure there's stuff out there that we haven't mentioned and that our listeners will find in their houses. But I think the most important thing is assign a place where it all lives.
Yeah, it just needs to not be, because it moves into a junk drawer all the time, doesn't it? If it doesn't, it just gets all thrown in. It's just so nice and very satisfying to have a nice stationery drawer, and that's what today's podcast was all about.
Definitely. So anything else to wrap up this podcast, Leslie, or are we there?
I think we're there. I think we're all done. I think we've exhausted our stationery chats for today.
Well, listeners, thank you so much for listening today. Good luck sorting out your stationery, decluttering and organizing it. And I hope this podcast was super helpful for you in getting that job done. If you'd like to get more tips and advice, please follow us on social media. We're on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook, and we've got a lovely, lively, supportive Facebook group community where we chat all things clutter. We'd love to see you there. If you don't want to miss the next weekly episode, please subscribe to the Declutter Hub podcast on iTunes, Spotify, and Stitcher, and it will pop into your notifications each Friday. See you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast. Check out declutterhub.com for more inspiration, and don't forget to tune in next week.